Good evening. Mondays in May are for marriages, and we are so glad that you've joined us again tonight. This is our second session of our Love Talk series, in which we are looking at communication. That communication is the lifeblood of relationships, and we want to improve our communication skills so that we can have healthier and healthier relationships, because we believe that will also improve our families, improve our churches, and improve our communities. So we are really glad that you've joined us tonight, and hope that you've already actually watched the second video by Drs. Les and Leslie Parrott on Right Now Media. If you haven't done that, I would encourage you to do that at some point, but hopefully you already have. And tonight, as we get started, instead of just jumping right into the material, I've got a little warm-up question on the handout that you can download off of our website, rchog.org. You can go there and you can download the questions that we're going to be looking at tonight. So we're going to start by just a fun little question. I'm going to ask my wife this and see what she remembers. What did you do on your very first date, and what was your impression of each other?
Well, our very first date was when we went to a movie that I actually asked you out on the date.
Yes, you did.
So my very first impression was that you were very shy. So I'm the one that asked you out on our first date. We went to the movie, watched a scary movie. Pacific Heights?
That's wow.
Was that what it was called? It was a scary movie.
Pacific Heights, yep.
And I know that I think your first impression of me was that I was really into you because I tend to watch TV out of the corner of my eye. So we were sitting side by side like this, and I was looking at you the entire time, but I was actually watching the movie. So I hopefully built your confidence a little bit.
It was a very interesting experience. Yes, I sat through the entire movie looking out of the corner of my eye, thinking that you were looking at me the entire time, staring at me. But who could resist, right? So, yep, that was our very first date. We were at Warner Pacific College, and after your band concert.
Yes, I invited you to my band concert.
Yep, you invited me to your band concert, and then we went out to that movie afterwards. So, yeah, and 28 years later, here we are. So, and we're glad to be with you. Well, I wanted to begin with just kind of reviewing what we talked about last week. Last week was all about Communication 101 and what it takes to have the basics of communication so that we can grow healthy communication in our relationships. And Drs. Les and Leslie feel that the most important skills are clarifying content, because words can mean so many different things that we really need to be willing to ask questions to make sure we truly understand what the other person is saying, because often we think we do, but we may not. And so clarifying content, and then reflecting feelings. And the whole idea behind reflecting feelings is to get deeper than just the grunt level of communication and just exchange of information, but really understand the why underneath what's going on in that conversation. So clarifying content and reflecting feelings were the first two skills, but what I really found maybe even equally as important in that first session was we have to make time to talk. Now, we talk all the time, but I mean making time to really talk. Again, to get below the surface, to really understand where each other is coming from. And the point of all of these, reflect feelings, clarify content, and make time to talk, the real key here that I hope you understand is that it's all about making the person that you're talking to feel valued. We're going to have all kinds of conversations. We're going to talk about all kinds of things. But it isn't necessarily the topic that we are discussing at the moment that's most important. The most important thing that we can do in any conversation with our spouse, with our children, with anyone, is to make sure that person we're communicating with feels that they are most important at that moment. That you are listening, that you are engaged, that you care about what they have to say. And so we talked about just a few of those positive things that you can do to help the other person know that you are engaged, like positive eye contact. Being able to always check in and let them know that you're engaged. An open and inviting posture, not closing yourself up, not watching TV and trying to listen at the same time. That's not an opening and inviting posture. tuned in gestures, doing things with your body language to help the person know that you are right there in that conversation and not engaged or distracted by something else. And then interested silence. Again, making sure that people know that you care, in some cases, because you're not going to jump in, you're not going to try finishing their sentences, which actually brings us to the last exercise from last lesson. That's where I wanted to kind of start tonight, and that is the exercise number 7, which is called Unwanted Advice. Now, this is something that I'm sure we've all been guilty of, and we need to learn when it's appropriate to offer our advice in a conversation and when we shouldn't, because oftentimes it's that unwanted advice at the wrong time or in the wrong situation that shuts down communication. And so that's part of these skills that we're going to be talking about and working on, is how can we eliminate those things that shut down communication, because when our communication stops, well, now our relationship doesn't have a chance to grow. And as we know, if something isn't growing, it's actually dying. And so we've got to eliminate those things in our relationship. So, honey, when it comes to unwanted advice, I know you've already looked through exercise number 7. What does that mean to you? What situations or what things that I might do when I offer advice are not helpful in our communication?
Well, about the only one that I could think of that really kind of becomes a stumbling block is when I'm driving.
Whoops.
My driving style is not exactly in tune with your driving style. And so therefore, many years ago, when I stopped flat in the parking lot in Boise at the Shopko and said, "You drive."
Ouch.
So that's about the only one, because I know that I don't drive the way that it would appeal to you, but I don't really want to hear about how I should drive.
Okay. And that's what this exercise is pointing out. It's pointing out that there are probably particular things that we do on a routine basis that we just don't want advice on. We're good. We're fine. So that's what you have to identify in this exercise, is what are those activities that you are regularly engaged in, that you can make sure as you go through these exercises together that you can learn from one another. Yeah, I don't need your advice here. And then hopefully on the flip side of that, you find out from each other when in the conversation is an appropriate time to offer advice. Because I know in my situation, when we're having a conversation or whatever, it's so normal to want to interject and offer advice too early. And I think that's another key we have to look at. But some couples are different. So that's the whole point of that exercise, is to kind of identify those times that you really don't need advice. It's only going to hurt the conversation. And then when would be an appropriate time to offer advice, and when not to do that. So that was the idea there on exercise 7. And I hope that you took time this week to sit down after you've each done those exercises independently and then talk those over, because that's what's really key, is understanding where you're both coming from when it comes to your different communication styles. And that's what we're going to jump into and really talk about tonight, is your different communication styles and what it is that allows you to have a good conversation and what it is that keeps you from having a healthy conversation. And it's very interesting. This is a concept that I'd never heard before, that Doctors Les and Leslie bring up in this book, that I think is really, really valuable. And I really hope that you will take this very seriously and consider for yourself what this might mean in your relationship and for your communication. What I'm referring to is what they talk about in chapter 4 as uncovering your fear factor. They say that this is the greatest stumbling block to love talk. And when I first was reading through this, I thought, that's the greatest stumbling block to love talk, your greatest fear factor. And at first I was a little bit skeptical, but then as I got into it, as I watched the video, it didn't take long for me to understand exactly what they mean. And I think they've really come upon a very important key here. And so here's what they say. They say that what makes you feel most emotionally safe is what then allows you to have a good conversation. But when you are engaged in your greatest fear factor, then that's going to cause you to not have a good conversation. And so what they say is that we all have one of these. It's one of four. Here they are. Gaining control of time, winning approval from others, maintaining loyalty, or achieving quality standards. Their premise is that each one of us, one of those four things, gaining control of time, winning approval from others, maintaining loyalty, or achieving quality standards, is what's most important to us, and therefore is going to be most important in our conversations. And so when we understand which one we are, well, then we can know that when that is being threatened, when that fear factor is rising to the surface, that's when I'm likely to shut down. Now, for me, it was interesting because I'd never thought about like this before, like I said, but gaining control of time was clearly my fear factor. No doubt about it. I realized that once I settled down and listened to this information. For some reason, I like to be efficient. I want to get things done. And when I feel like my efficiency is being threatened or challenged, then clearly that is my greatest fear factor. Honey, what would you say of those four attributes there in chapter 4 is your greatest fear factor or stumbling block to love talk?
Okay, well, in the exercise, they said to rank them, and I kind of had a hard time between 1 and 2.
Okay.
But I finally settled on approval. I don't want to put people off. That really is a biggest fear for me. I'm constantly thinking about how other people are going to react.
Okay.
But then also loyalty,
Okay.
continuity, keeping an even keel for things is also really high on my list.
Okay.
So
So Suze is referring to exercise 8, which I hope you will do, and they do. They say obviously there could be more than one, but to rank them and to see which one is maybe more important than one of the others, but certainly we could have more than one. Now, the next step they take in chapters 5 through 8 is they then correlate these 4 fear factors to some questions that we all have to answer, and we do it all the time in our communication, but we don't even stop to think about it. And so let me just give you those questions real quickly. They say, how do you tackle problems? How you tackle problems is going to impact one of your fear factors and might hurt your communication. Do you tackle them aggressively, or do you tackle problems reflectively? They say that 25% of our conversations deal with how to tackle problems. And so we've got to understand how each other deals with that question. How do we tackle problems? Because we're most likely going to be different. And when we tackle problems differently, that can cause conflict in our relationship. But if we can understand it ahead of time, that this is just who we are, it's our personality, then maybe we can overcome some of these frustrations when we tackle problems in different ways. The second question is, how do you influence each other? By feelings or facts? Well, I think you can pretty quickly see how that's going to be a difference in our communicating styles. Is it feelings or facts that we use to influence each other? The third question is, how do you react to change? Are you resistant to change, or are you acceptant of change? That too, we have to understand how we each deal with that. And then the fourth question is, how do you make decisions? Do you make them cautiously, or are you more spontaneous in your decision making? And so this is a really, really good thing to consider, all 4 of these questions. And I hope that you will take the time to sit down and discuss this with your spouse as to how those all pertain to you, because when you have a better appreciation of where your spouse is coming from, then hopefully when you have those conversations that you're tackling a problem, you're influencing one another, you're reacting to change or making decisions, that you won't just immediately get defensive when they start communicating in a way that might be different from you. And I'm just going to admit that the reality is, for most couples, we are polar opposites on most things. And we just have to recognize that God actually intended that for a benefit in our relationship if we will capitalize on the blessing of it. Unfortunately, most couples don't realize the benefit of having that opposite trait, and it just becomes a curse in their marriages. And so we want to overcome that. So that's what the material, chapters 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 is talking about. And so we're going to dig in just a little bit deeper into our handout for this week and talk about some questions that we're going to go over, and hopefully you are sharing this along with us. This next question on our handout says, in what situations is it more likely for you and your spouse to have a conversational meltdown? Honey, when do you think that you and I have our hardest times communicating?
I don't, I think it's probably when there's miscommunication, misunderstanding, when we don't fully understand where the other person is coming from. Okay. And if I jump to conclusions or I try to figure things out too much, or without actually stopping to just ask you what you're thinking and why you're thinking it, that maybe that would be when it is. That would be my guess. I don't know. Do you have other thoughts?
Well, like I said, it was pretty powerful for me when I realized my fear factor is time. That I for some reason, and I guess I come by it honestly, I got thinking about why that is, and I realized that both of my parents were always extremely busy, always doing something, and so learning how to be efficient with my time, I think is something that I just learned from my parents. And so I think when I feel like we're in a conversation, when I've got something to do or something's on my mind that needs to get done, I'm afraid that that's when our biggest meltdowns occur, is when I feel like I've got something that just has to be done right now. So I think that's what it is for us, an awful lot of time. Okay, like I said, do exercise 8 because it helps you figure out what your fear factor is. And then we're going to move on to the next questions here. Which of the 4 needs do you resonate with the most? I think we've already talked about that. In what ways have you seen that need play a factor in your marriage? Well, I just shared that. I think we melt down when my fear factor of time is challenged, And so ask those questions of yourself and see what you can pinpoint there as your greatest fear factor. Okay, then moving on. Knowing each other's perceived fear factors, how might you approach your conversations differently? How might you use this new insight to improve your conversations? So, honey, again, you felt like your main fear factor was approval of others. Mm-hmm. Okay, and so if I would, now that I know that, the whole point here, the whole idea is, if I'm in a conversation with Suze and I understand that that is her greatest fear factor, then I'm going to want to validate that in her, knowing that that's what she wants. I know what it is. She values relationships, and she wants to make sure that the communication is building the relationship and not tearing it down. And that's most important to her. And so I have to understand that and validate that in her. Vice versa, if mine's time, how does that work for you?
Well, it just means that I have to be really mindful when you do have other things that you need to be doing and I need to pick the time in which I choose to have a conversation so that it's not conflicting with your desire to get things done. It doesn't mean you don't have times when we could have a conversation. It just means I need to not pick a time when you're in the middle of something to try to have a conversation.
Yeah, and that's true, but I think we also, here's a caution that I just want to share. I've seen this happen in a lot of relationships, that oftentimes some people are so fearful of intimate relationships, or not, I shouldn't say intimate relationships, but conversations, that being busy and always on the go, doing something can sometimes, not always, but sometimes can be a coping mechanism for not wanting to have those conversations. And so if you're like me and it's time is your fear factor, I have to really evaluate that and say, is it truly that I've got something important to do, or am I just using this as an excuse because I don't want to have this conversation right now? I think we all have to be very honest with ourselves about that and make sure that we're not circumventing conversations just because we're uncomfortable. There are going to be uncomfortable conversations, but in a marriage especially, we have to be willing to have those conversations. Now, there may be a more appropriate time than another, there's no doubt about it, There's certainly better ways to do it than another, and that's what we're working on. But we cannot make excuses and not come to the table, if you will, and have those conversations. Okay. Now the next couple of questions deal specifically with those 4 questions about that you have to answer on how you go through life, how you make decisions, how you influence each other. So, what's the biggest change the two of you had to face in the past year? Be in positive or negative, be it positive or negative. How did you each adjust and cope with the change, and how would you describe your differing or similar styles? So, what's the biggest change do you think we've had in the past year?
Past year? Other than COVID-19?
Yeah.
That was probably the biggest change, and then anticipating. I think for me it's been more the anticipation of our youngest child going to college next year, and the changes that is going to have. So it's not necessarily a change that's already happened, but a change that I am very much not looking forward to, but anticipating coming. And I think we've both been wrestling with that a little bit.
So according to Les and Leslie, do you feel you are more resistant to change or more accepting of change in general?
I think on a spectrum, I would tend more towards the resistant to change, because I am also one that likes that consistency, that loyal part, that just kind of, I don't like to rock the boat a whole lot. I like to keep things on an even keel, and so I would imagine that I would be more resistant to change on the spectrum.
Yeah, and I think this is something that you and I are kind of alike on. I think we've learned how to accept change, but it's not our default hardwiring. I think we are more resistant to change, and so certainly whether it be our boys moving on to college or whether it be this COVID-19 thing, that's not easy for us, and we just have to recognize that, and we have to be able to talk through it. And I think that's something that's important. If you are resistant to change, I think one of the only ways to help you through that is you have to be able to talk it out. If you don't talk it out, then it just kind of stays there inside your own mind and rolls around, and you don't feel any resolution, and maybe you have this constant kind of unsettled feeling that maybe you don't really know what it is. Well, maybe it's because your personality type is resistant to change, and maybe you've had a lot of change going on in your life, like many of us have recently. And so being able to talk that out is going to be critical. Whether one of you is really accepting of change or you're both resistant or whatever, communicating about that's going to help no matter what. Okay? Well, the next question says, identify a decision the two of you had to make recently. Which one of you was more cautious or more spontaneous? Is this representative of most decisions you make together? So maybe let's just kind of boil it back down to that question, because it's about how we make decisions. And is it cautiously or spontaneously? Which way do you think you fall, honey?
Well, I think, again, we're fairly similar, I would think. I tend to be more cautious. However, I think I'm more spontaneous at times. So, for example, the van, this is not a recent decision, but this was a decision a few years ago. And I think you would have approached the purchase of our van more cautiously. I fell in love, wanted the van. I need the van. And so,
that's true.
And I think, but I don't normally make spontaneous decisions. I usually think it out pretty well.
You do.
But there are times, I think, when maybe it just hits me the right way or whatever, that sometimes I can be spontaneous, but normally I'm not.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It just dawned on me as you were saying that, that the most often times that you are spontaneous in making a decision is when the price tag is really, really high.
I'm sorry.
It just dawned on me right then. Our house and our car, you wanted to make a decision like that. Everything else, you are pretty cautious. Okay, I've got to keep that in mind moving forward in life.
I don't know with the house that it was so much the price tag, but it was the situation that we were in, and I wanted it to be different.
Well,
so
both wasn't the price tag.
Yeah.
It was the situation we were in, and you wanted to get out of it, and you saw, that vehicle or that car as the solution.
Yeah.
And so why wait around? Let's just solve this problem.
Yeah.
Which has worked out good in both cases. But you've got to ask yourself. You got to be honest with yourself, because it is very common for one person in a relationship to be spontaneous, want to make decisions quick, let's move on, let's be efficient with our time, and the other to be more cautious, want to hold on, want to think this through, because maybe considering the feelings of other people, that loyalty thing, or wanting quality standards, wanting to make sure that things are done right. Now that's important to some people. And so you really need to figure that out as to who you are and your spouse, so that then when you come on those decisions or those situations in which you feel like you're conflicting one another, it's just simply because of, this is the way I look at life. This is the way I think things ought to be done. And so again, I believe God brought us together, oftentimes as opposites, to complement one another. And so we have to see these differences as blessings and not curses. Let's take a look at a scripture from Proverbs 16:24. It says, gracious words are a honeycomb, sweet to the soul and healing to the bones. What are some examples of grace-filled words, and what makes gracious words have the power to heal someone, like Proverbs 16:24 says?
Grace-filled words. I don't even know if it's so. It is words. Things like it'll be okay. Everything will be fine. Reassuring types of words. But I think it's more the attitude and the tone with which it comes across. I think that it's a gracious heart and a gracious feeling that comes with whatever the words are. That, this is going to be okay. I love you for who you are. I understand that you're feeling this. I can tell that. So for me to be gracious to you would be not to be frustrated when you do have something you need to get done, and I want to have a conversation about something, but instead for me to say, hey, can we have this conversation later? And for me to show you that I'm trying to be gracious and understand the situation that you're in, and yet also let you know that we need to have a conversation or something like that.
No, I think that's absolutely it. The words, as we've already talked about, words are less the issue and more about our body language and our tone of voice. That speaks volumes. And so I think to offer gracious words is exactly what Suze is talking about there. It's the attitude of our heart in which we come to that conversation and use those words that's really huge. In what ways could gracious words help create a safe environment for you and your spouse?
Well, I think that when you're willing to see things from somebody else's perspective and offer them grace based on what they are going through, it's going to open up their graciousness towards you. We always have to consider, I think, being the proactive one and leading with how we want to be treated. That's what Christ says to do, is that we are to love others and to treat others as we would like to be treated. And so we have to offer that grace, and when we do, I believe you have a much better chance of having it reciprocated towards you, thus creating a safe environment for you as well. So when you strive to make a safe place for conversation for somebody else, you in return are likely making a safe place for you.
You reap what you sow, right? You reap what you sow is just a universal law that God put in place. And it is so true. Now, does that mean every time, every conversation you ever have, when you instigate graciousness, that's going to be returned? No, not every time, but more often than not. When I think about this question, I think about not having a critical nature, not being argumentative. Those aren't, being critical and argumentative, those aren't safe places for conversation. And so that's gracious to not be that way, to come with, like you said, more of a humble heart, wanting to really know what the other person is going through, what they're feeling, why they're saying the things they're saying, it has a huge difference. It really is a cycle that can build on itself, and it goes either way. If that cycle starts getting critical and judgmental, it's going to probably just devolve that way. On the other hand, if the cycle starts with grace and love, then usually it heads that direction as well, because we reap what we sow. And so really think about that this week. How could you provide a safe place for your conversations by coming to them with grace and not a critical or argumentative spirit? Because grace and love always win out. They always win out, and it is so true in our conversations as well. So here's what we hope that you will do this week. We hope that you will read through those chapters 4 through 8, and you will really consider what is your fear factor, and how is it that each of you go about those 4 questions that we just talked about. And then again, what could it look like for you to create a safe conversation space for you and your spouse? And what are some gracious words that you could say to your spouse this week? That's what I hope that you will concentrate on, and take some time this week to sit down and to look at that exercise, especially exercise 8 together. And then before we meet next Monday, hopefully you can watch video number 3 on Right Now Media of Les and Leslie Parrott's Love Talk. And until then, we hope you have a wonderful week building your relationship based on great communication. We love you. God bless you. Have a great week.